Ambassador Lyra stood before the crystalline mirror in her private chambers aboard the Etherian diplomatic vessel, examining her form with practiced precision. Her iridescent skin caught the light in perfect fractals, each angle mathematically precise, each movement a calculated dance of light and symmetry. The Etherians had spent millennia perfecting their species, engineering themselves into living works of art where even a single asymmetrical feature was cause for correction. Today, however, would test every measure of her diplomatic training. Humans were coming aboard her ship. The very thought made her crystalline features ripple with discomfort. Ambassador, her assistant Theron's voice chimed through the communication crystal, the Earth delegation has docked. They await your presence in the Grand Hall. Lyra took one final look at her reflection, ensuring her geometric patterns were aligned in optimal harmony. Acknowledged, she responded, her voice carrying the musical qualities typical of her species. The journey to the Grand Hall was brief but gave her time to prepare mentally. The Etherian ship, like its inhabitants, was designed with perfect mathematical precision. Every corridor, every chamber followed the golden ratio. It was a testament to their superiority, their mastery over chaos and imperfection. The doors to the Grand Hall parted silently, revealing the Earth delegation. Lyra felt her crystalline structure tense involuntarily. There they stood, three humans, their forms so chaotic they seemed to mock the very concept of design. Their lead diplomat, Marcus Wells, stepped forward, and Lyra had to suppress a shudder. He was tall for a human, with skin marked by what her people would consider flaws, tiny spots they called freckles, lines around his eyes and mouth, and hair that refused to follow any predictable pattern. His nose was slightly crooked, perhaps from an injury, and his shoulders weren't perfectly level. Yet he moved with a confidence that seemed at odds with his imperfect form. Ambassador Lyra, he spoke, his voice carrying unexpected warmth, on behalf of Earth, we thank you for hosting these discussions. His green eyes, asymmetrical in their flecks of color, met hers steadily. Lyra inclined her head precisely 15 degrees, the proper angle of diplomatic greeting. The Etherian consensus welcomes you aboard the harmony of precision, she replied, her words measured and exact. We trust these negotiations will prove productive. As they moved to the conference table, Lyra noticed something that disturbed her perfectly ordered thoughts. Despite his obvious flaws, Marcus Wells moved with a grace that seemed to arise not from calculation, but from something else entirely. His fellow diplomats, a woman named Jade with skin like Earth's fertile soil and a man called River whose hair had started turning silver, displayed similar qualities. The negotiations began, focusing on the establishment of trade routes through Etherian space. Earth needed access to these lanes for their expansion efforts, while the Etherians sought certain rare minerals found only on human-controlled worlds. It should have been a simple matter of calculating optimal outcomes. Instead, Lyra found herself increasingly distracted by the humans' method of discussion. They didn't follow the precise protocols her people had refined over centuries. They interrupted each other, spoke with varying volumes and emphases, and used their hands in expansive gestures that seemed to have no mathematical basis. During a recess, Marcus approached her as she stood examining a crystalline sculpture. Beautiful piece, he commented, studying the perfect geometric patterns. Though I notice all your art follows similar forms. Of course, Lyra replied, her tone suggesting this should be obvious. Beauty lies in perfection, in the adherence to universal mathematical principles. Marcus smiled, creating more of those inexplicable lines around his eyes. On Earth, we often find beauty in variation, in the unexpected. Here, let me show you something. He pulled out a small device and projected an image into the air, a garden full of flowers, each one different from the next. These are roses from my mother's garden, he explained. No two are exactly alike, yet most humans would consider them beautiful. The variations, the small imperfections, they're what make each one unique. Lyra studied the image, trying to suppress her initial reaction of disorder. How can you find beauty in chaos? She asked, genuine curiosity seeping into her carefully modulated voice. Perhaps what you see as chaos, we see as character, Marcus suggested. Every scar, every wrinkle, every variation tells a story. They're records of lives lived, challenges faced, moments of joy and sorrow experienced. The conversation was interrupted by the return of the other diplomats, but Lyra found herself returning to it in her thoughts as the negotiations continued. She caught herself studying the humans more closely, noting how their expressions shifted with their emotions, how their voices carried meanings beyond their words. That evening, in her private chambers, Lyra found herself doing something unprecedented. She adjusted her appearance harmonizers, allowing a small asymmetry to remain in her geometric patterns. Standing before the mirror, she studied this imperfection, this tiny flaw in her otherwise perfect form. For the first time in her existence, she wondered if there might be something her people had missed in their pursuit of perfection. The thought was simultaneously disturbing and exhilarating. As she prepared for rest, a message arrived from the human delegation. They had prepared a cultural exchange presentation for the following day's session. Lyra found herself experiencing an unfamiliar sensation as she contemplated this upcoming event, anticipation. Perhaps, she mused, observing the slight asymmetry she had allowed to remain, there was more to learn from these humans than she had initially thought. The mathematical certainties that had governed her existence suddenly seemed less absolute, and in their place, she felt the stirring of something new, curiosity about the beautiful chaos that humans seemed to embrace so readily. As the ship's lights dimmed to simulate night, Lyra realized that tomorrow would bring more than just diplomatic negotiations. It would bring another opportunity to explore this strange new perspective on beauty and perfection. For the first time in her carefully ordered life, she found herself looking forward to uncertainty. The cultural exchange presentation never happened as planned. Instead, the Harmony of Precision's emergency alert system activated at 0300 ship time, its crystalline harmonies shattering the carefully maintained peace. A micrometeoroid storm had struck the vessel's starboard section, compromising several crucial systems. Lyra rushed to the command center, her normally perfect form slightly disheveled from sleep. The sight that greeted her was one of controlled chaos, Etherian crew members moving with precise efficiency, yet unable to fully address the cascading failures threatening the ship. Status report, she demanded, watching as the holographic displays showed spreading damage across multiple decks. The impact breached our outer hull, First Engineer Helios reported, his crystalline form pulsing with stress patterns. But that's not our primary concern. The meteoroids carried an unknown mineral composition that's reacting with our biocrystalline systems. Standard repair protocols are proving ineffective. A second alarm joined the first, its discordant tone indicating an even more serious problem. The ship's life support systems were beginning to fail, their perfectly calibrated patterns disrupted by the strange mineral contamination. Ambassador. Marcus Wells' voice caught her attention. He and the other human diplomats had arrived at the command center, looking remarkably alert despite the hour. We've been monitoring the situation. Let us help. Lyra's first instinct was to refuse. The thought of humans touching their advanced technology, with their imprecise hands and chaotic methods, seemed wrong on a fundamental level. But as another system failure alert sounded, she realized she had no choice. The contamination is spreading through the biocrystalline matrix, she explained, pushing aside her discomfort. Our repair methods rely on perfect symmetry and harmonic resonance. With the matrix corrupted. Then we need to think asymmetrically, Marcus interrupted, moving to study the holographic displays. Jade, you're our xenomaterialist. What do you make of these readings? The human woman stepped forward, her dark eyes scanning the data with intense focus. The mineral composition, it's similar to something we encountered in the Proxima system. River, remember the crystalline virus that nearly destroyed the mining colony? River, his silver-streaked hair catching the emergency lights, nodded. We developed an electromagnetic pulse sequence that disrupted its growth pattern. If we modify that approach. Lyra watched in fascination as the humans began working. Their method was nothing like the precise, ordered approach her people would take. They spoke over each other, argued, drew rough diagrams with their hands in the air, and somehow, made progress. Marcus turned to her. "We need access to your ship's electromagnetic control systems. And we'll need to modify them in ways your people might find uncomfortable." Lyra felt her geometric patterns ripple with anxiety. Modifying the ship's systems without proper calculations and simulations went against everything her people believed in. But as the life support warnings became more urgent, she made her decision. "Helios, give them access. Full authority." What followed was unlike anything Lyra had ever witnessed. The humans worked with a controlled chaos that defied her understanding. They modified the ship's perfectly calibrated systems with improvised solutions, creating asymmetrical energy patterns that should have been catastrophic. But somehow, they weren't. "The contamination is responding," Helios reported, his tone carrying surprise. "It's retreating. The biocrystalline matrix is stabilizing." Lyra moved closer to observe Marcus as he worked. His hands flew over the control interfaces, making adjustments that followed no pattern she could discern. Sweat beaded on his forehead, another human imperfection that suddenly seemed less repugnant. There was beauty in his concentration, in the intensity of his green eyes as they tracked multiple data streams. Hours passed in a blur of activity. The humans didn't stop for rest breaks at mathematically optimal intervals. They worked until exhaustion threatened, then pushed beyond it. Their solution wasn't elegant by Etherean standards, it was messy, improvised, and thoroughly effective. As the last emergency alerts faded into silence, Lyra found herself standing next to Marcus at the main observation window. The star field beyond was as perfect as ever, but she viewed it with different eyes. "How did you know it would work?" she asked, genuinely curious. There were no simulations, no certainty. Marcus smiled, those fascinating lines crinkling around his eyes. "We didn't know. But that's how humans operate, we try things, we fail, we adapt, we try again. Our imperfections force us to be creative." Creative, Lyra tested the word. "We have no equivalent concept. Our solutions come from careful calculation and perfect execution." And yet, Marcus gestured at the now stable ship around them, sometimes the perfect solution isn't the right one. Sometimes you need a bit of chaos to solve a problem. Lyra found herself studying his face again, but with new understanding. The asymmetry of his features, the small scar near his temple, the uneven curl of his hair, they weren't flaws to be corrected. They were records of experiences, of problems faced and solved, of life lived fully. "Perhaps," she said slowly, "we have something to learn from each other." In the days that followed, as repairs continued and negotiations resumed, Lyra noticed changes in her crew's interaction with the humans. The initial aversion to their imperfect forms had been replaced by something like respect. She caught Helios engaged in lengthy discussions with Jade about alternative approaches to engineering problems. Even the most traditional members of her crew showed interest in human problem-solving methods. More surprisingly, she noticed changes in herself. The strict adherence to geometric perfection in her own form began to feel less crucial. She found herself allowing small variations, tiny asymmetries that would have been unthinkable before. Each one felt like a tiny act of rebellion against millennia of conditioning. During one rest period, she discovered Marcus in the ship's cultural center, studying an Etherean art piece, a crystalline sculpture of mathematical perfection. "Beautiful," he commented as she approached, "but static. It will never change, never grow, never surprise you." "And that was always the point," Lyra replied, standing beside him. "Perfection, once achieved, needs no modification. Doesn't it?" Marcus turned to face her, his expression thoughtful. "The universe is constantly changing. Wouldn't true perfection include the ability to adapt, to grow, to become something new?" Lyra felt her patterns shift in response to this idea, creating an unplanned display of colors that rippled across her crystalline form. To her surprise, she didn't immediately correct it. "You've changed since we first met," Marcus observed quietly. "Is that a compliment or a criticism?" she asked. His laugh, warm, genuine, imperfect, filled the space between them. "From a human? Definitely a compliment. Change means growth, and growth means life." As Lyra returned to her duties that day, she carried these words with her. The harmony of precision had been damaged and repaired, but it wasn't the same ship it had been before. Like her, it now carried subtle marks of human influence, hybrid systems that blended Etherean precision with human adaptability. Perhaps, she reflected, watching her crew work alongside the humans with increasing comfort, that was a kind of perfection too. Lyra stood at the viewport of the descending shuttle, watching Earth grow larger beneath them. The planet was a swirling canvas of blues and greens, whites and browns, all mixed together in patterns that defied mathematical prediction. Like everything about humans, their homeworld was beautifully chaotic. She was making history, the first Etherean ambassador to visit Earth's surface. After the crisis on the harmony of precision, both species had agreed to deepen their diplomatic relations. But as the shuttle entered the atmosphere, Lyra wondered if she was truly prepared for what awaited her. "Nervous?" Marcus asked from the seat beside her. He'd been appointed as her official guide for this visit. "Etherians don't get nervous," she replied automatically, then caught herself. "Though I admit to some uncertainty." The shuttle broke through the cloud layer, revealing a sprawling city below. Unlike the precise geometric patterns of Etherean cities, this one spread organically, following the contours of the land. Buildings of various heights and styles stood side by side, some gleaming with modern materials, others weathered by age. The apparent disorder made her geometric patterns flutter. They landed at a private diplomatic facility, but even here, Lyra noticed the presence of living plants growing in seemingly random patterns. A warm breeze, variable in both temperature and intensity, carried unfamiliar scents. "Welcome to New Singapore," Marcus said as they disembarked. "One of Earth's most diverse cities. We thought it would be a good introduction to human culture." Their first stop was a historical museum. Lyra had expected to be repulsed by the primitive artifacts of human development, but instead found herself fascinated. Each piece told a story of adaptation and growth. Unlike Etherean artifacts, which were created in their final, perfect form, these human creations showed evidence of trial and error, of learning and improvement. "This pottery," she said, studying a display of ancient vessels, "the patterns are uneven." "Made by hand," Marcus explained. "Each piece unique, carrying the mark of its creator. We call these irregularities, character." They moved through the museum's galleries, each one challenging Lyra's preconceptions. The art section particularly caught her attention. Unlike Etherean art, which strove for mathematical perfection, human artists seemed to deliberately introduce imperfections. They painted scenes with blurred edges, sculpted figures with exaggerated features, and created music that didn't follow precise mathematical progressions. "But how do you know if it's good?" she asked, standing before an abstract painting. "There are no objective standards to measure against." Marcus considered this. "We measure it by how it makes us feel. Art isn't about perfection, it's about connection, about evoking emotion and thought." The concept of measuring anything by feeling rather than objective standards was foreign to Lyra, yet she couldn't deny that these human artworks affected her. Her crystalline patterns shifted and changed as she viewed each piece, responding to something beyond mathematical appreciation. Their next stop was even more challenging, a public park. Here, nature had been partially tamed but not completely controlled. Trees grew in organic patterns, their branches reaching in all directions. Flowers of different colors and shapes bloomed together with no regard for symmetry. Children played on equipment, their laughter carrying across the space in irregular bursts. "It's so alive," Lyra observed, watching a group of birds take flight in a formation that constantly shifted and reformed. "That's exactly it," Marcus said softly. Life isn't perfect. It's messy and unexpected, and that's what makes it beautiful. As they walked through the park, Lyra noticed how humans interacted with each other. They didn't maintain precise distances or speak in measured tones. They hugged, laughed, argued, and reconciled. Each interaction was unique, unpredictable, and somehow meaningful. The day's final destination was a surprise, a dance performance. Lyra had experienced Etherian dance, where movements were calculated to mathematical precision. This was different. The dancers moved with both grace and power, their bodies telling stories through motion that seemed to arise from deep within. "They're not all moving in perfect unison," she whispered to Marcus. "Each dancer interprets the music in their own way," he explained. "They're working together but maintaining their individuality. Watch." As the performance continued, Lyra began to see what he meant. The dancers created something larger than themselves precisely because they weren't identical. Their slight variations in timing and movement added depth and complexity to the whole. Later that evening, in her specially prepared quarters, Lyra stood before a mirror, studying her reflection. Her crystalline form was still geometrically precise, but she noticed small changes. Her patterns flowed more freely now, responding to her thoughts and emotions in ways that would have horrified her just weeks ago. A message chimed, tomorrow's itinerary. They would visit an open-air market, a music concert, and finally, Marcus had added a note, something special. The old Lyra would have demanded details, needed to prepare for every contingency. Instead, she found herself looking forward to the unknown. She spent the night by the window, watching the city below. As darkness fell, lights came on in patterns that seemed random but created a beautiful tapestry. Occasionally, she caught glimpses of people in their homes, cooking, talking, living their imperfect lives. The next morning brought rain, another new experience. Water fell from the sky in droplets of varying sizes, creating patterns that could never be predicted. Lyra stood under the protection of an awning, watching humans hurry past with umbrellas or simply walking through the rain, their clothes and hair getting wet. "We can reschedule if you prefer," Marcus offered, appearing beside her with 2 umbrellas. Lyra studied the rain for a moment longer, then made a decision that would have been unthinkable before. She stepped out from under the awning, letting the raindrops fall on her crystalline form. Each drop created tiny ripples in her patterns, 1,000 small imperfections that lasted just moments before fading. "No," she said, turning to Marcus with what she realized was her first genuine smile. "I want to experience everything." The market was an assault on all her senses, colors, sounds, and smells mixing together in wonderful chaos. Vendors called out in different languages, food cooked in tiny stalls, and people from all walks of life brushed past each other in the narrow aisles. She found herself drawn to a stall selling handmade jewelry. Each piece was unique, crafted from materials that weren't perfectly pure or precisely cut. The vendor, an elderly woman with deep laugh lines around her eyes, noticed her interest. "Would you like to try one?" she asked, holding out a necklace made of rough-cut crystals. Lyra hesitated, then nodded. The weight of the necklace against her crystalline form felt strange but not unpleasant. When she looked in the small mirror the vendor held up, she saw how the imperfect crystals complemented her own geometric patterns, creating something new and unexpected. "Beautiful," Marcus said quietly beside her. "It suits you." Lyra bought the necklace, her first possession that wasn't geometrically perfect. As they continued through the market, she found herself collecting small things, a hand-painted tile, a slightly asymmetrical ceramic cup, a scarf with an organic pattern. Each item represented a tiny rebellion against her people's obsession with perfection. The music concert that afternoon was held in an ancient building with worn stone steps and walls that bore the marks of centuries. The acoustics weren't mathematically perfect, yet somehow the slight imperfections in the sound made the music more real, more touching. But it was Marcus's "something special" that truly changed everything. As the sun began to set, he led her to a small, weathered building on the outskirts of the city. Inside, she found herself in an artist's studio, where a woman named Isabella was teaching children to paint. Not art class, Isabella corrected when Marcus introduced them. We call this creative expression. There are no rules here, no right or wrong way to paint. The children barely seemed to notice Lyra's alien appearance, too absorbed in their work. She watched as they mixed colors with abandon, painted outside the lines, and created images that bore little resemblance to reality but carried powerful emotion. Would you like to try? Isabella asked, holding out a brush. Lyra looked at the blank canvas, then at her own crystalline hands. I don't know how. That's perfect, Isabella smiled. Neither do they. That's not the point. The point is to explore, to express, to create something that's uniquely yours. With trembling hands, Lyra took the brush. She stood before the canvas for a long moment, then began to paint. She started with geometric patterns, it was all she knew, but gradually, something changed. The patterns began to flow, to blend, to break apart and reform in ways that had no mathematical basis but felt deeply right. When she finally stepped back, she saw that she had created something unlike anything in Etherean art. It was messy, imperfect, and entirely her own. Her patterns rippled with emotion as she studied it. What do you think? Marcus asked softly. I think, Lyra replied, watching the children continue their joyful creation around her, that I'm beginning to understand what your people mean by beauty. The news of Lyra's contamination spread through Etherean society like a crack in a perfect crystal. Images of her wearing the rough-cut crystal necklace, her patterns flowing with unconstrained emotion, had caused unprecedented debate in the Geometric Council. Now, standing before that august body, Lyra faced the consequences of her transformation. The council chamber was a marvel of crystalline engineering, its walls forming perfect fractals that repeated into infinity. 7 council members sat in an arrangement of flawless symmetry, their forms so perfectly maintained that they appeared almost identical. Once, Lyra had found this sight breathtaking. Now, she saw only stagnation. Ambassador Lyra, First Counselor Zenith's voice resonated with mathematical precision, you stand accused of violating our most sacred principles. You have willfully introduced asymmetry into your form. You have engaged in chaotic human practices. You have suggested that imperfection might have value. The last word carried a tone of disgust. Lyra stood straighter, her new confidence visible in the way her patterns shifted and flowed. Honorable Council, I do not deny these actions. Instead, I ask you to consider that our understanding of perfection may be incomplete. A ripple of disturbance passed through the watching crowd. In the front row, Lyra spotted Theron, her former assistant, whose patterns betrayed a mix of concern and curiosity. Behind him stood a group of younger Etherians, their attention focused intently on the proceedings. Explain yourself, Counselor Nova demanded, her perfect form rigid with disapproval. Our pursuit of perfection has led us to stagnation, Lyra stated boldly. We create the same art, think the same thoughts, solve problems in the same ways, all in pursuit of an ideal that prevents growth. During my time on Earth, I witnessed a different kind of perfection, one that embraces change, celebrates diversity, and finds beauty in the unexpected. She gestured to her crystal necklace. This was crafted by human hands. It's not geometrically perfect, yet it possesses a beauty our mathematical standards cannot measure. Like the humans themselves, it carries the mark of its creation, its struggles, its uniqueness. You speak of barbarism, Counselor Apex interrupted. These humans you admire so much are primitive creatures who saved our ship when perfect symmetry failed, Lyra countered. Who solve problems in ways we never imagined. Who create art that moves the soul and music that speaks to something deeper than mathematics. To demonstrate her point, Lyra did something unprecedented in the council chamber, she began to dance. Not the precise, calculated movements of Etherean dance, but the fluid, emotional style she had learned on Earth. Her patterns flowed and shifted, creating displays that defied geometric prediction but held their own hypnotic beauty. The chamber erupted in chaos, some Etherians recoiling in horror, others watching with poorly concealed fascination. Among the younger members of the audience, Lyra noticed several whose patterns had begun to shift in unconscious mimicry of her movements. "This is outrageous." Counselor Apex rose from his seat, his patterns rigid with anger. "She has clearly been corrupted beyond redemption. I move for immediate nullification and restructuring." "Before you vote," Lyra spoke quickly, "know that I am not alone. There are others among us who question our rigid adherence to geometric perfection. The younger generation especially." "She speaks truth," a voice rang out from the crowd. A young Etherian named Vega stepped forward, his patterns deliberately shifting into asymmetrical forms. "We have watched the human broadcasts, studied their art, their music. We see the power in their imperfection." More voices joined in, more patterns began to shift and flow. The council chamber, for the first time in its history, filled with uncontrolled movement and debate. First Counselor Zenith struck the resonating crystal, its pure tone cutting through the chaos. "Enough. This disorder proves the danger of human influence. Ambassador Lyra, you will submit to immediate geometric correction. As for these, sympathizers," he gazed sternly at the crowd, "they will undergo remedial harmony training." "No," Lyra's voice rang out clear and strong. "I will not submit to correction, and neither should they. Look around you, look at the energy in this room, the passion, the genuine emotion. When was the last time our society experienced anything truly new?" She turned to address the crowd directly. "We call ourselves perfect, but we have engineered ourselves into stasis. The humans, with all their flaws, continue to grow, to create, to evolve. They find beauty not despite their imperfections, but because of them." The chamber had grown still, but it was not the familiar stillness of Etherian order. It was the stillness of change gathering momentum. "I propose a choice," Lyra continued. "Let those who wish to explore this new way of thinking do so. Let us create spaces where geometry can flow freely, where art can evolve beyond mathematical precision, where dance can express emotion rather than equations." "You would divide our society?" Counselor Nova asked, but her tone held more curiosity than condemnation. "It is already divided," Vega stepped forward again. "Between those who question and those who conform. Between growth and stagnation." The debate raged for hours. Traditionalists argued for preservation of their perfect society, while reformers pushed for change. In the end, it was neither side's complete victory but something new, a compromise that would have been unthinkable before Lyra's transformation. The Geometric Council, swayed by the growing support for change among the younger generation, established the Asymmetric Initiative. This controversial program would allow volunteer Etherians to explore alternative forms of expression, while maintaining traditional geometric perfection as the society's foundation. As Lyra left the council chamber, she found Marcus waiting outside. He had been invited as an observer, a controversial decision that itself spoke of changing times. "That was quite a performance," he said, those familiar lines crinkling around his eyes. "Though I suspect the real challenges are just beginning." Lyra nodded, watching as groups of Etherians departed, some maintaining rigid geometry, others allowing their patterns to flow with new freedom. "Change is never perfect," she replied, then smiled at the irony of her words. "You've started something remarkable," Marcus observed. "A revolution of thought." "No," Lyra corrected him, touching the rough-cut crystal at her neck. "We've started something imperfect. And that makes it even more remarkable." That evening, as news of the council's decision spread across Etherian space, Lyra stood in her chambers, watching her patterns flow freely in the mirror. Each shift, each asymmetrical pattern represented a small victory for growth, for change, for the beauty of imperfection. A message chimed, young Etherians were gathering in the cultural center, experimenting with human-style art and dance. Another message followed: traditionalists were organizing protests against the asymmetric initiative. A third message announced the formation of a cultural exchange program between human and Etherian artists. Lyra smiled at her reflection, at the being she had become, neither perfectly Etherian nor chaotically human, but something new, something between. The path ahead would not be easy, but then, as she had learned from humans, the most beautiful things rarely were. 5 years after the formation of the Asymmetric Initiative, the Grand Exhibition Hall of the newly constructed Unity Center hung suspended in space between Earth and Etherian territory. Its architecture was unlike anything either species had created before. One half featured the perfect crystalline geometry of traditional Etherian design, while the other displayed the organic curves and unexpected angles of human architecture. Where the two styles met, they blended in ways that shouldn't have worked, yet somehow created something entirely new. Lyra stood at the central junction, her form a testament to the changes of the past years. Her crystalline patterns flowed freely, incorporating both geometric precision and emotional expression. The rough-cut crystal necklace that had once caused such scandal was now joined by other pieces of human artistry, each one chosen not for perfection but for meaning. "Nervous again?" Marcus asked, approaching from the human section. The years had added more silver to his hair, more lines around his eyes, and Lyra found these changes beautiful, markers of time, experience, and growth. Anticipatory, she corrected with a smile. "Today will either validate everything we've worked for or it won't," Marcus finished. And even that would be a perfectly imperfect outcome. The Unity Center was preparing to host the first Convergence Festival, a celebration of both cultures and the new forms of art and expression that had emerged from their interaction. It had been Lyra's idea, supported by both the progressive members of the Geometric Council and Earth's diplomatic corps. The first guests were arriving, humans and Etherians streaming in from opposite ends of the structure. Among the Etherian visitors, it was easy to spot the traditionalists with their rigidly maintained geometric patterns, the progressives with their flowing forms, and the fascinating spectrum of those who had found their own balance between the two extremes. Young Vega, now a prominent artist in the asymmetric movement, had created the central installation. It began as a perfect Etherian crystal matrix but gradually transformed into organic shapes inspired by human art, with the middle section capturing the moment of change itself, order flowing into chaos, chaos crystallizing into new forms of order. "Ambassador Lyra," a familiar voice called. Turning, she saw First Counselor Nova approaching. The former traditionalist had become an unexpected ally over the years, advocating for controlled change while helping preserve the best aspects of Etherian culture. "First Counselor," Lyra greeted her. "I'm honored you chose to attend." "How could I not?" Nova's patterns shifted slightly, something that would have been unthinkable for a council member in the past. "This center represents the greatest change in our society since we first achieved geometric perfection. Though," she added with a hint of humor, "some would say it represents our greatest crisis." "All growth comes through crisis," Marcus offered. "It's the human way. And increasingly, the Etherian way as well," Nova acknowledged. "Though not without cost." Lyra knew what she meant. The asymmetric initiative had caused deep divisions in Etherian society. Some colonies had rejected it entirely, maintaining their rigid adherence to geometric perfection. Others had embraced change so enthusiastically that they risked losing their cultural identity entirely. Finding balance had become the greatest challenge. The exhibition halls were filling up now. In one section, human artists worked alongside Etherian creators, combining traditional crystalline techniques with organic human expression. Another area showcased technological innovations born from the collaboration between human intuition and Etherian precision. The medical section demonstrated how Etherian geometric healing techniques were being adapted to work with the asymmetric nature of human biology. But it was the performance hall that held the day's main event. As the scheduled time approached, Lyra made her way to the stage. The audience before her represented the full spectrum of both species, humans and Etherians, traditionalists and progressives, skeptics and enthusiasts. 5 years ago, she began, her voice carrying the musical quality of her people but with inflections learned from humans. I stood before the Geometric Council as a supposed aberration. Today, I stand before you as a bridge between our peoples, and I am not alone. She gestured to the stage behind her, where a group of human and Etherian performers waited. What you are about to witness is neither human nor Etherian art. It is something new, born from the space between our cultures. The performance began with pure Etherian crystalline harmonies, mathematically perfect and precisely executed. Gradually, human instruments joined in, the organic sounds of string and wind instruments weaving through the geometric patterns of sound. The music should have clashed, should have created discord, but instead it gave birth to new harmonies. Then the dancers emerged. Humans moved alongside Etherians whose patterns flowed like liquid crystal. Traditional Etherian geometric dance merged with the emotional freedom of human movement. At the center of it all was Vega, his crystalline form shifting in ways that defied traditional physics, creating patterns that were both mathematical and emotional. Lyra felt Marcus's hand slip into hers, another small act that would have once been unthinkable. Together they watched as the performance reached its climax, the boundaries between human and Etherian art dissolving into something that belonged purely to the present moment. When it ended, the silence lasted for 3 heartbeats. Then the applause began, spreading through the human section of the audience. After a moment's hesitation, the Etherians joined in their own way, their patterns shifting in synchronized appreciation. The two forms of acclaim merged, just as the two cultures were learning to merge while maintaining their distinct identities. Later, during the reception, Lyra moved through the crowd, observing the interactions between the two species. Young Etherians eagerly engaged with humans, their patterns shifting in response to new ideas and experiences. Even some of the traditionalists were cautiously engaging in discussions with human scientists and philosophers. She found herself in the art gallery, standing before a piece that captured her attention. It was a collaboration between a human painter and an Etherian crystal artist, a perfect crystalline structure that appeared to be in the process of joyful dissolution, or perhaps it was chaos in the process of crystallizing into order. The longer she looked, the harder it became to tell which was which. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Marcus said, joining her. "Though I can't quite tell what it's supposed to be." "Perhaps that's the point," Lyra replied. "It's not supposed to be anything except what it is, a moment of transformation captured in art." They were interrupted by an excited group of young Etherians and humans who had been part of the first cultural exchange program. Their excitement was palpable as they described their plans for new collaborations, new forms of art, new ways of combining the strengths of both species. "Look at them," Marcus said softly after the group had moved on. "They don't see barriers between species anymore. They just see possibilities." Lyra touched her crystal necklace, the same one that had started everything. "We're not perfect yet," she observed. Marcus laughed. "That's precisely what makes it perfect." As the festival continued around them, Lyra reflected on the journey that had brought them here. The path hadn't been straight or predictable or perfect. There had been setbacks and resistance, breakthroughs and revelations. But standing here, watching humans and Etherians create something new together, she understood a truth that went beyond both species. Perfect symmetry was beautiful, but it was static. Perfect chaos was dynamic, but it was unstable. The real beauty lay in the dance between the two, in the moment of transformation, in the courage to change, in the wisdom to preserve what was valuable while embracing what was new. As if reading her thoughts, Marcus squeezed her hand. Above them, through the transparent ceiling of the Unity Center, stars shone with both mathematical precision and wild beauty. Somewhere among them, new possibilities were waiting to be discovered, new forms of beauty waiting to be created, new definitions of perfection waiting to be understood. Lyra's patterns shifted in response to her emotions, creating a display that was neither purely geometric nor completely freeform. It was, like the Unity Center itself, like the performance they had witnessed, like the future they were building, something in between. Something new. Something perfect in its imperfection.